Hello and welcome to another Creative Critique live webinar. Thanks for joining me, and I certainly hope that all of you out there are healthy and safe. For those of you who are here for the first time, this webinar is about providing you with fair and honest critique of your images with the intent of helping you grow creatively, challenging you beyond your comfort zone, right? To consider ways of seeing and thinking about photography that will help you improve in the most meaningful ways possible. And for me, that's about creating images that express your emotional connection to your subject. I've gotten a lot more images since the last webinar. I'm over 150 now, so my goal is to try to get to as many images as possible. I want to be fair, and I want to try to not get too much into the details of each image, but give you what the most important thing you can do with that image is to improve it. And so depending on what that is, I may spend a little more or a little less time on your image. It doesn't mean that I think it's less worthy of spending time on. It just means that I'm trying to give you what the most important thing is, the most critical aspect that I think will help improve the image. I've also decided, like the last webinar, to start every webinar with a short introductory topic, something that I think will help you, again, to improve and grow in terms of your photography, whether it's composition or Lightroom techniques or so forth. And in this webinar, I'm going to continue with the same theme as last time, which is composition and the idea of LCU, but I'm going to dive deeper into one of those areas of the LCU framework that I talked about. Let me just switch to something here. All right, the next thing I want to show you is, very quickly, if you want to go full screen, you should have an icon here now on the bottom left-hand side, not where this black area is. That should go away. That allow you to click and go into full screen mode. Remember that if you go into full screen mode, you will not have access to the chat and the questions here. You can always come out of full screen when you want to use that. The second thing I ask is that the first tab here is the general chat, which means if you want to just chat and talk amongst yourselves, that's fine. But please reserve your questions to the second tab here. Don't put any comments here, but don't put any comments to yourselves. Anything that you want me to respond to or answer, please only put that here, because that makes it easier for me to review the questions and see how to answer whatever question you're asking me. Alrighty. The other thing also is that I got a few questions last time about some of the software that I've been using. One is when I draw on my screen. I'm on a Mac, and that is a software called ScreenBrush, which you can find in the App Store. There are many similar type apps, but I find this one to be the easiest one to use. Okay, so let's get into today's topic, and I'm going to switch over here. So last week, I talked about LCU as a compositional framework, right? So LCU is an acronym that stands for lead the viewer, establish the center of interest, and unify the composition. And those three sort of key elements it's kind of the framework and the foundation that I use to compose every image. Also to evaluate every image. I want every image that I make to kind of match or to check off these three things. And one of the common questions that I get concerns center of interest, because I think there's a lot of confusion about what a center of interest is. How is that different from subject matter or focal point or focus point even? So that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. Let's talk about center of interest. Let me just say that a foundational principle for me is that the aim of any picture is to attract and hold the attention of the viewer. Okay, I think that if you're not trying to do that with your images, then I'm not sure what kind of art you're making, because the goal is to share something with someone else. That doesn't mean that you're making your images for someone else. You're making them for yourself because you want to express something that you feel inside of you. But of course, the sharing part, the communication part, is the thing that I think we all want to do. And so your pictures, again, you want them to attract and hold the attention of the viewer. And those two things are different, but very, very important. Attracting someone's attention is difficult, but not so difficult today. If you just increase your saturation to 100 on every image, you're going to attract viewers. But you also want to hold their attention. And holding their attention is much more difficult because, of course, an image with a saturation of 100 is not going to hold your attention for that long because it's going to be boring and it's not going to be interesting or captivating or, all these things that we can talk about when it comes to art. So let's discuss subject matter. Your subject matter is the thing that your picture is about. And that could be visual or emotional. Okay, it doesn't have to be something that you see in the picture, but it could be something that you feel. In fact, I would say that when it's emotional, it's probably a much more powerful picture than when it's visual. But that's your subject matter, okay? Now, the focal point is perhaps something visual in the image that anchors the image. Okay, so the focal point could be your subject matter. It could be your subject matter, but it doesn't have to be. But if you've got, let's say, a person in your picture, I would call that the focal point. Is that the subject matter? Not necessarily, because the subject matter could be the person's expression, and their expression is conveying some emotion to you. So the subject matter would be the emotion that's coming through the image, but the focal point would be the person. Okay, so again, the focal point is a particular visual element or an actual part of the picture itself within the frame. The center of interest is the thing that dominates the picture. And the word dominance is also very important because your center of interest should dominate the picture. If it doesn't dominate the picture, if you've got more than one center of interest, then you've got a conflict, you've got a problem, potentially. The center of interest can also be a mood or a theme, and that's related back up to the emotional aspect. So it doesn't have to be a specific thing. It could be just the mood of your picture or the theme of your picture can be the center of interest. And finally, light can be the center of interest. And those are typically some of my favorite images, or the images that I probably strive to make more than anything else. The reason for that is because the most direct way to convey emotion in an image is through light, because light is everything. I mean, light captures emotion, color, contrast, shadow, highlights, so many concepts that I can discuss here, and I will in the future. But light can be a center of interest. So again, I'm just trying to get you to understand these different definitions and not get locked into one particular thing. People will ask me, well, I don't have a center of interest in my picture. I don't have one specific thing. And what they mean is maybe that they don't have a focal point. They don't have, one big giant tree in the center of the picture. But to say that your image doesn't have a center of interest is to say that it's ambiguous. It's to say that it doesn't have something that is going to hold the attention of the viewer. Okay? So let's take this a step further. When I started making images, my images were very visual. I was denoting things. To denote means to show something visually. And so I was photographing things, trees, water, people, whatever, okay? But it was a specific subject. Another way of thinking about that is a place or location. What is this picture about? Oh, it's about this specific location or this specific place. These are very literal images. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but this is about as far away from the emotional and the communicative part of an image that you can get in terms of fine art photography or fine art in general. By that I mean that, again, when you're trying to convey something inside, literal images tend to be descriptive. They're showing you something. They're basically showing you what you see is all there is to experience. And for me, my objective over the last 15 years since I started making pictures professionally has to move away from that towards the emotional side of image making or connoting things. To connote means to suggest. And I mentioned this word suggesting last week. When you start making images that are more emotional, instead of you describing an image or instead of you looking for others to describe your image in terms of tree or water or place or location, you start to hear people saying, wow, it's so peaceful or serene, or it's happy or sad or dramatic or calming, okay? And this is where you get more figurative or metaphorical. If you look at the great paintings that have ever been made over time, they tend to be in this category. If you think about any art, music that you listen to over and over again, as soon as the music comes on, it takes you to a place, but it also evokes an emotional response in you. And so I bring this up because when you think about the center of interest as a specific thing, you're usually more on the left side of this chart. Whereas when you think about the center of interest in terms of light or as a mood or a theme, you're more on the right side. And again, if your goal is to convey something through the visual language of photography, then you want to move more towards the emotional side of making images. And I give you all of this because this is the foundation by which I'm going to critique your images. I use this as sort of my starting point, my first principle. And the more that I see your image is ambiguous or having multiple dominant areas, that's when I'm going to do a lot of cropping or showing you how you can simplify the image. Simplifying doesn't mean making an image that is narrow. By that I mean you can make an image that is very clear and direct and emotional with a wide angle lens, certainly, but you have to be very, very careful about design, because the design is what's going to either put you on the left side of this paradigm here or on the right side. Okay, so let's come out of this. Let's go into Lightroom. Just looking at questions here in case there are any. No questions yet. Okay, good. So let me jump into the images here that I've selected for this week. And we're going to start off with this image by Jeff Davis. And what I like about this image is it's first, it's the color. That's the first thing that you see that pulls you in. The abstract pattern of colors and shapes. It's got a very painterly kind of look to it. Pastel type colors, but they're very saturated and very strong, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Then you've got the reflection, which creates a sort of asymmetrical reflection to the patterns on top. And I say asymmetrical because it's not divided down the middle, it's down a third. So that's generally speaking a good thing because you've got some variation here. So I like that about the image. I like its simplicity, I like the textures, and of course I like the pattern of colors, which is very interesting and invites you to explore. The thing that I think I would improve here is that we need to, I think, make the image a little bit more variable in terms of tonality. And by that I mean that every part of the image is kind of the same brightness. It's got the same amount of contrast. And so you want to try to get your viewer moving through the image. The more a viewer moves through an image, the more you're able to increase or hold their attention because there's more areas to explore. So, I mean, one easy way to do that would be, you could do something like a vignette, something like that, and you can see immediately how that kind of creates a movement from the edges into the center. The other thing that I would probably suggest too is to tone it down a little bit. I think it's a bit too powerful, too strong. I think the colors here can be more suggestive by making them a bit softer. And so maybe by that I mean let's take down the contrast a bit. And we'll pull down the vibrance a little bit. Maybe not so much in the blacks, so it's not so crushed, and a little bit lower in the contrast. And I'm going to pull even some more vibrance out of this. Something like that, just to make it a little bit smoother, a little bit softer. I wouldn't consider this image or call this image loud or dramatic. It's very strong in terms of patterns and colors, but certainly not as strong as the original here, which I think is a little bit too powerful, overbearing for what you're asking the viewer to see. The other thing potentially also is maybe creating a bit more of a transition at the bottom. So again, I'm just going to darken the bottom a little bit by creating a gradient with a graduated filter. And that again just invites the viewer to come up from the bottom into the picture. But otherwise, really nice in terms of the design and the pattern, and simplifying an image, which is probably more difficult to do than you would think, because I've been to this location and there's lots of different things to photograph here. But I think that's a nice pattern. Again, just making it a bit easier for the eye, more suggestive, holding the interest a bit longer. All right, so thanks, Jeff. Next image is by Holger Mishki. Hope I pronounced that correctly. This image is also very, I would say it's very interesting rhythmically, texturally, beautiful patterns of the trees through the image, lots to explore, lots to sort of look for in the image and get lost in, right? Like lots of detail and lots of depth. I like that. I also like the simplicity of the black and white. I like the repetitive pattern of the image. So those things all work well. Having this tree in the center here is somewhat jarring. I think it could be a little bit off to one side. I'm hesitant to do any kind of cropping because we've got very strong edges, very strong shapes on the edges. So I could come in maybe something like that, but I'm just trying to find a little bit more of asymmetry, getting that tree off center a little bit. So I think that might help a little bit there. The other thing though that I would suggest is creating more depth through the use of sharpness and diffusion. And by that I mean that as I see it right now, the entire image is calling for attention. Every bit of the image is equally sharp, equally contrasty, and I think that can be fatiguing, right? So I think we can soften parts of the image so that there's more depth and it leaves something to explore on repeated viewing. So I think there's two ways to handle that. First thing I would do is I'm going to call up a graduated filter, and with this, no, I'm sorry, an adjustment brush. Sorry about that. And I'm going to take out the clarity and the sharpness. And basically I'm looking to soften parts of the image. And so I'm going to just put this in here like that, maybe in here like that. Not so high here because these trees get closer to us. Maybe a little bit here. Okay. And I'm basically pushing back these areas. And so you can see the mass there. Also, I hope that all of you are seeing just one adjustment brush now. I think you are. That's because the software that I was using for streaming last time was causing some issues. So hopefully now you're only seeing one adjustment brush. So that's the first thing I would do, is to soften these areas. The second thing I would do is I'm going to call up a new adjustment brush, and I'm going to make this one well, let's just say I'm going to do it manually here. So I'm going to open up the shadows, and I'm going to add some exposure, and I'm going to use this to, again, soften some of the tones in these trees. Okay, I think they are too strong and they are competing with the focal point. Okay, now focal point, I'm specifically talking about this tree here in the center. This for me is the focal point of the image. The center of interest is probably just the repetitive nature of the trees, the pattern that's created in this image. For me, that's the center of interest, but the focal point is obviously what's closest to us and what's dead center. And I wanted to move it a little bit off center, which is why I did the crop. But the second thing is softening up some of these trees so that they don't scream out as much. They don't call for attention. It's like this tree, these trees here on the edges, and this one here, this one here, this one on the right side, they're all wanting to take center stage, and they are never going to be able to become more important than this tree because it is closest to the viewer. But in terms of their darkness, I think that's a problem. And so that's why I'm lightening them up a little bit. Okay. And I might even just brighten this on this side like that. And I'm going to undo that. Let me just do that a little bit softer by reducing the flow. Okay. And I think that creates an image that is more inviting, still maintains the repetitive nature of the picture, the beautiful abstract quality of the repetition, a lot of rhythm in this picture because your eye bounces around from all the different trees, different distances and widths between those trees, different shapes, different intervals, if you will. There's the before. I think too strong, trying to say too much without needing to. And there's the after. All right, so thanks very much, Holger. Moving to the next image. Image is by Gerald Prunty. Thank you very much for sharing. When I look at this image, my eye immediately goes to the bottom right here, perhaps, and if it doesn't go here right away, it goes to this tree here on the left-hand side, this bush. What I like about the picture is the beautiful greens, the beautiful textures in the image, and the way your eye kind of flows up through here, bouncing around these repetitive shapes. So very nice, beautiful repeating shapes in this area. This little road adds a little context there, a little accent, if you will. At the beginning, though, I said that my eye perhaps went here first, but more likely it's going to go here. And for me, compositionally, the problem is that once I go here, I don't really have anywhere else to go. I mean, we can look over here, certainly, but I'm not flowing here. My eye is not being told to go there. It doesn't give me a path. And so I think that while this tree is interesting, while this tree is, it's beautiful in its own right, it doesn't quite fit into the composition, into the way that your eye is going to move through the picture. So I will probably do something like this. In fact, we can even go a little bit more because, again, this little lake here, not that important. What's most important is the shapes. Now we've got your eye coming in on the bottom right, and it moves diagonally up through here, maybe on this closer ridge, then over to these further ridges away, bouncing, repeating up to the sky, and then back again. And you've got the textures and the colors and the green to lead you through the picture without something that just doesn't feel right, which is that other bush that I cropped out. If we had that tree or that bush repeating through the picture, then maybe. But again, the weight of that is too far on the left side. It's throwing the picture too much to the left. All right, so I would remove that. Let's redo again. And then some basic dodging and burning to increase the contrast in the image. Let me go with a darken. I'm looking at some of the textures that are darker and using those as a way to create more depth and dimension. And I'll show you when I'm done what that looks like. So that's my adjustment brush that I added. And if we increase this effect, something like that, a new adjustment brush, this will be brighten or dodge, to just highlight some of the light that's coming in here. Oops, sorry, I had to increase the flow at 100. There we go. And then I will probably do something like this. So I want to create more depth in the image. I'm going to warm up the temperature of the whole entire image a tiny bit. Maybe something like that. And then we'll go into HSL, and just the blue channel, I'm going to change the hue of the blue channel and make it a little bit bluer. something like that. And we can also drop the luminosity, a little bit of the blue channel, to really make the blue sky a counterpoint to the rest of the image. So again, there's the before and there's the after. And what I'm looking for is, I want the eye needs to flow through the picture this way. And again, we've got that nice S curve that is always more interesting. You can even come in this way, but we're entering in the corners, flowing with an S curve through the image, generally speaking, and returning back again. Anytime you can move with curves and with diagonals through your image, it makes the path for the viewer much more interesting. And the viewer, by the way, the person who looks at this picture, whether they're a photographer or not, they're not thinking in terms of all these concepts that I'm talking about. They're using the natural process of how we look at a picture and how we look at art. That's a natural thing that we recognize. Lights and shadows, contrast, those are things that we're just subconsciously attracted to. So thank you, Gerald, for sharing. Hope that was helpful. Next picture is by Nicole. What I like about this picture is, first, there's something about the black and white nature of it that makes it much simpler, much more abstract. It really gives us a sense of the shapes and the lines. Of course, we've got a person in the picture that's gazing off towards the right. So that's always interesting. And what I think will strengthen this image is, one, not creating a ambiguity between whether we should be looking over the left here or where she's looking to the right. If you look at this image, if you were to remove the person, if you were to remove the subject, the focal point, okay, we can call this the focal point. If we were to take this person out of this picture, your eyes would flow over there. And that is the main problem with this picture. The main problem is that everything in the picture graphically pushes us this way. Clouds, more interesting, mountains, distance, trees, everything is changing this way, but yet she's looking that way. And that is that is ambiguity, right? That's two different things that are trying to dominate the way we flow through the picture. So first thing I would probably do is crop this a little bit. Maybe something like that. And then we've got to create a bit more variation in the picture. We've got to add some whites and blacks and give the image more contrast. It feels a bit flat now. We can use those shadows and the darks to kind of create more interest and lead the viewer so that essentially they want to go around like this and back up here. So let's just adjust whites and blacks. Something like that. Add some contrast, add some clarity. Maybe a bit more exposure. And then I'm going to create some movement this way. Again, we want to keep the eye moving this way. So I'm going to use a graduated filter. To create kind of a gradient. And then a brush. And we'll use, well, let's start with a darkening brush or a dodge burn brush. Now notice, I was about to apply a stroke here, right on this cliff, and I did not. Why didn't I? Because while this cliff can be darker on its own, I don't want this cliff to call more attention than it needs to call. In other words, we need to keep the focus of the attention here in the center. And if I start making this part of the picture more interesting, well, again, we're just telling the viewer to go off in this direction. I want to keep the viewer's interest moving through here, so I'm darkening these areas. So you can't adjust you can't adjust parts of a picture simply because it makes that part of the picture improved. You always have to keep a sense of how it's impacting the entire image. What is it doing to the image as a whole? And if it doesn't help the image as a whole, then it's weakening the image. Okay. Maybe stronger shadow here where she's standing. Okay, and then we'll create a new adjustment brush, and this will be lighten, and I definitely want to make her stand out a little bit more. Okay, and maybe make the feeling of light a little bit stronger on these areas that are getting light. Okay, and these are just, again, general adjustments. They're not the end and be all. I would go slower and be more careful, but I would still be using the same mindset, the same approach, even if I was working on this image more slowly and more carefully. So that's the before the crop, or after the crop, and there's the after. And I think now we're really telling the viewer what the image is about, what the focal point is, and the center of interest is really how it feels to be in this beautiful landscape, gazing off into the distance, breathing fresh air, let's say. That's kind of what I'm beginning to perceive from this picture. But you have to make that clear. There's a connection between her here and the trees and the cliffs, her gaze. All of that has to be thought about when you are composing and thinking about how you're going to convey something to the viewer. Right, thank you. Next. This image is by Bill. So my first impression of this image is painterly, beautiful pastel colors, very abstract in nature, very beautiful, very soft and serene. All of those words can be improved if we get rid of what is not contributing to that. And what is not contributing to that is, you guessed it, this left part of the picture. Yes, it creates an anchor. You can argue that. You can say that it leads the viewer in at a diagonal, but leads them where, right? Like for me, what this image is about it's about the colors. It's about the abstract nature of these patterns here. Okay, so if we do this, then the image really doesn't have any of those qualities. But if we do this, then I think we maintain all of those aspects that I just mentioned. It's not a perfect situation, of course, because I'm cropping what's already captured, and if you were going to frame it this way, you would have done it differently in the field. I understand that. But I'm trying to show you how to strengthen what we have here, how to use the concepts of design to improve what you're trying to say in an image. So now, something like this, we can do some basic adjustments. Let's improve the increased vibrance. Add a little bit of contrast, maybe too much vibrance. Maybe a little bit brighter overall exposure-wise. Some clarity. Actually, texture is what I prefer. Okay. Now we've maintained the abstract painterly feel of the image. It's, I think, much more suggestive. We're able to explore and look along the reflection of the water as well as into the back portion of the image up the side of this mountain without anything kind of getting in the way of that. It's very clear what the dominant part of this picture is, which is the color and the abstract shapes. And the viewer is led through the picture with the variation in color. I come in here through the darks, and then I'm led up to the different colors. Eventually I get to something that's more textured, more defined. That keeps me moving up. You can lead a viewer through a picture, of course, with leading lines, but the leading lines doesn't specifically have to be an actual line. It could just be different patterns or shapes that lead the viewer successively from one area to another. And that's where the idea of color and contrast and tone comes in. All right, thanks very much for sharing that, Bill. Next. Images by Malcolm Cross. Thanks for sharing. So I would say that the focal point of this image is these rocks capturing or catching the beautiful warm light coming into the scene. I would say the center of interest, the thing that makes this image, is the light. The light is the thing that is giving you a way to look through the picture, which is giving us a sense of the warmth of the image. It's giving us a sense of what it feels like to be in a place like this. I think what's happening here is that there's maybe a bit too much. We've got rocks along the edge here, and maybe too much here for the eye to keep exploring and wandering with, and not really be led to the main center of interest. And the center of interest is really what gives us this feeling of light. So I would probably do a slight little crop, maybe something like that. Maybe a little bit up from the bottom. Well, maybe not. Down from the top. So now your eye is moving through here. All right. Again, look at how your eye moves through the picture, the path that you follow through the scene. Anytime you've got a curve like that, a way to keep you moving through the picture, you know that you've got design that is working, design that is going to make the composition more interesting. Oh, get out of this tool. Okay. The other thing I would suggest also is adding a little bit of warmth to the image. I like the effect that's on here. It's kind of a cross-processed effect. The highlights have warmth and some of the shadows here are kind of bluish. I think it might be a bit overdone. Why? Because again, what is the dominant portion of this image? It is the light hitting these rocks. And if we make the foreground too dominant, too interesting, that detracts from that. All right, so let me try warming this a bit. Notice when I warm it, there's a better connection now between the foreground and the background. They connect a little bit better because they're not so different from each other. And again, we want to get the eye flowing as easily as we can to the center of interest, right? The other thing is I'm going to add an adjustment brush here, some dodging and burning again. And I'm going to darken some of these areas to improve that flow, to improve the attraction that the viewer is going to have to following this path up to the light. I'm also going to darken down some of these rocks here, just so that they're not as bright as where we want the viewer to wind up at, which is here. Okay, so there's our before, and there's the after. So not a lot in terms of the adjustments, but they make a big difference. And you should be seeing a pattern here, especially if you watched last week's webinar, which is that you don't need to do a lot of heavy-handed work to dramatically change the way an image feels. In fact, I would say that your goal should be to make your adjustments invisible, to make the things that you do in Lightroom invisible to the viewer, so that it just looks natural. It just looks like the way you would expect something to look and feel. If the viewer can see your adjustments, if something doesn't look quite right, or it looks heavy-handed, or it looks as it looks like it's been manipulated, then that doesn't mean that manipulation is bad. It just means that the viewer is not, there's now some impediment between the viewer being able to appreciate what you're sharing and them seeing the adjustment. And you want to remove all those impediments. You want to create the clearest connection between what you want to share and what they're seeing and experiencing. All right, thank you. Next image. This image is by Edison Wong. Thank you, Edison, for sharing. I like the movement of my eye. My kind of eye moves in this way, obviously along the road. Anytime you have a road in a picture, that's going to be a very strong way to look through the picture. And we've got this beautiful mountainscape in the back. And we want, again, to create flow. We want to create movement through the image as strongly as possible. So I'm going to simplify this a little bit. I think it can be a bit simpler. Maybe here, maybe bring the sky down or the top of the image down a bit. Why is that? Because our sky really is just the same from here up to the top. So we want to create as much variation as possible. And I think we can improve this a bit with some contrast. In fact, I'm going to go to the tone curve and try a strong contrast curve. That's a bit better. I'm going to use an adjustment brush here to create some stronger lines here for the eye. I'm going to drop the flow, a little more variation here so that our eye moves from the bottom to the top, right? We want to create, or we want to enhance what's there already. We're never really creating anything in terms of editing in Lightroom. At least I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to enhance, to make visible what we see with our eyes and feel when we're in a scene, and make that visible with what we capture, because the camera is a poor approximation for what we're actually seeing and experiencing when we're in a location. And so these adjustments are not adding something that isn't there. They are basically trying to compensate for the weakness of the camera compared to the way we see and experience something. Okay, new brush. This will be lighten. And just trying to maintain the sparkle of the light on the tops of these bushes. Definitely here. And maybe, no, I'm going to keep the same temperature, but I'm going to do what I did in the last image, which is, or in a couple of images back, which is to go into the luminance channel for blue, actually hue, and cool off the sky a little bit. So that's what I'm doing. This is green, and this is more towards blue in the sky. And a little bit stronger in terms of the sky, saturation-wise. And maybe some more saturation overall, vibrance. Okay, so there's the before, and there's the after. I like the image. I like the depth and perspective that it has. I like the dramatic nature of it. I think it probably has a bit too much in the foreground, and there's no way to really crop it here. This is one of those examples where in the field, you basically have to step forward with your camera so that the foreground becomes a lot simpler. By that I mean something like this. Okay, except that if I crop it like this, we lose the dramatic nature of the horizon with all the mountains along that. So that's why I hesitated to do this initially. But that's really what you want. This bush here really isn't helping us all that much. There's already enough leading us through with the road and with these bushes here. But this is the best I think that we can do with what we have. And also, again, accentuating the highlights, accentuating the light. All right, thanks, Edison. Next image is by Ingvar Levin. Thank you for sharing. Beautiful image, beautiful sort of feel to this picture. This is another great example where the focal point, the subject matter, is the violinist, but the center of interest is not her. The center of interest is, for me, what I see is just incredible joy that she's taking in playing this instrument. Her enjoyment of the instrument, maybe what it sounds like. I'd love to hear what it is that she's playing, especially with that light coming down. It just shows a celebratory nature to music making, to an artist. Those are all things that are the center of interest, not necessarily the subject matter. So I think the processing, I think the way the image is developed is really nice, really beautiful. The only thing I would suggest is, how can we strengthen the things that I just talked about in terms of what the center of interest is? And I think we can do that by simplifying the composition. We don't need all of this space over here. We certainly don't need the space down here either. And we can create more of a diagonal movement, make the image more interesting by taking some of that away, maybe coming up a little bit. I mean, this is really where the action is happening. Her facial expression, her hand and her arm, and the instrument itself. We can also create a little bit of tension here by bringing the edge of her sleeve here right up to the edge of the picture, because that creates some tension and it gives us a way for the eye to move up through here. Maybe slightly down like this, but I definitely like those light beams coming down. Again, that's not the most important part of the image, but they definitely create a sense of direction. And the last thing I would probably do is add a vignette, something like that, to again increase that sense of directness about her and her emotion. But this is a great example again of making an image that is clear, unambiguous, and improving it through, again, getting rid of what we don't need, make it about exactly what the image is about, get rid of the stuff on the edges that don't really add anything to the picture. Thank you. I've got some questions here as far as was it posed? It looks unnatural. I don't know. These are images that were submitted, so I can only work with what I've got. I don't know the origin of the images. Okay, so this image is by Blasco. Thank you for sending. I like the composition in terms of how simple it is. My eye essentially moves through here from the reflection up to the lighthouse itself. You can start at the lighthouse, you move down here, and then you're going to go back up again. There's nice continuity there. There's a nice symmetry that isn't an exact symmetry, but it's close enough. That's something that you typically get with reflections. And I like the soft, evocative light on the lighthouse. I think that's very nice. So all of that really works. I think in terms of the composition itself, I would probably pull in a little bit from the right. Actually, maybe not. Maybe keep it where it is. But I think from the bottom, I would definitely push this up a little bit, like so that we've got a little more of a break there. We don't have that complete closing of the water in the bottom, because now we pick up those edges on both sides that keep us moving through the picture. And then the other thing I think this image could really use is a little more variation. You need more variation in the color and in the tones. Right now it's a bit flat, top to bottom, meaning that, for example, the tone on the tones on all the buildings are the same. There's not really a sense that the lighthouse is more dominant than the other buildings. This building here obviously is nowhere near as important as a lighthouse, and yet it's just as bright. In fact, it's red. And even this rock face here, even down here, it's pretty bland, and we can get a little more interest in these areas by doing some simple adjustments. So one is, I'm going to add my trusty graduated filter again, like so, and we're going to darken the water so we got a little gradient there. And I'm going to brighten up the water entirely in a minute, but just that to give us that sense of movement from bottom up through the picture. I'm going to grab an adjustment brush and make this darken. Let's darken this down, maybe darken the edge here. And I'm going to darken one side of the lighthouse. because I see that the light is probably coming more from the right-hand side. And so one side of the lighthouse is going to be a bit darker. The other side is going to be a bit brighter because of the direction of light. That gives us a bit more dimension in the picture. And maybe darken some of these areas here as well. So that's that adjustment brush, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. Where's my pen? There it is. Okay. I'm going to add a new adjustment brush, make it lighten, and now we will lighten the lighthouse, our focal point. Maybe add a little bit of dimension to these rocks. A little bit here where these rocks are catching some of the side light. Lighten up the reflection just a hair. And then I'm going to drop the flow and just, generally speaking, add a little bit of sparkle to the reflection on the bottom there. Remember that I've got that graduated filter on top of it, darkening the bottom half, so I can apply this on top and it's still going to keep that gradient. And I'll increase this a little bit. There we go. There's our before and there's our after. And I think now you can see how those small little adjustments make the lighthouse itself the focal point and the center of interest of the picture. It makes the lighthouse the dominant part of the image, but not dominant where you don't notice everything else, dominant in the sense that now your eye has a destination, a place to go to, but everything else is still acting as a way to unify the entire picture. So again, before and after. Thank you, Blasco. All right, next. This image is by Don't Know. Whoever it is, thanks for sharing. I think generally speaking, the editing is okay. I love obviously the dramatic color of this fall or autumn scene with the waterfall coming through. I love waterfalls because I instantly start to think about the sound that waterfalls make and how hypnotizing and mesmerizing that is. That's all wonderful. I think the problem here is, again, one of composition and design. Yes, there are some interesting leading lines here. There's a way that my eye flows or follows these logs up to the waterfall, except that I've got this gigantic shape here that I have to contend with. All right, and how do we compensate for this shape, given that this is the way we want the eye to flow through the picture? So I think the only way to do that is to increase the diagonal strength of the image, which is contained right here. And the way we do that is by cropping in this way. Maybe cropping down. We still have the canopy of leaves. We still got that beautiful yellow. We still have the sense that it's fall, and we still have everything that I mentioned before, except now it's much more direct. It's much simpler. It gets to the center of interest in a much simpler way. And I think it's nowhere near as ambiguous as it is before with all that extra space on the right. So once again, you have to think about the entire image. Yes, these logs are interesting, but by including these logs, you're weakening the image because you're also including areas up here that, while they are yellow, and that makes it one simple shape, it's a shape that is uninteresting. Frankly, it doesn't have much variation going on. In fact, I would say that if it was even more interesting, let's say there was a hole here and you could see the sky, that would even make it worse, because now you would have a stronger reason to kind of go up this way and out the picture. So I think that is a much stronger composition, and that's what I would focus on. The other thing that you might want to try as well is making the water a bit cooler. That gives you a sense of separation. I could try adjusting the temperature of the image, but not sure that's going to work because I don't want to lose the warmth of the leaves and the tree and the foliage. So I could grab an adjustment brush, apply that, keep forgetting to increase the flow, there we go. Apply that to the water and cool that off just a little bit. Something like that. And now we create a lot more separation between the cool nature of the water and the warmth of the light and the foliage all around it. All right, thanks very much for sharing. This image is by Don't Know, but thanks for sharing. So I love the beautiful colors in this picture. I love the softness, the ephemeral nature of the water, which is looks like it's blurred through some long shutter speed, 1 second. I like the light, which is very soft and delicate. I love all those things, and I really get a sense of walking along the beach here. The main problem with this picture is one of visual weight, and the visual weight is unbalanced. All of the visual weight is right here on the edge of the picture, and this visual weight, in my opinion, is not balanced with the left side here. As much as I want my eye to go this way, I can't help but continuing to come back this way again and remain stuck here. I can't really enjoy this over here. I can't really feel as though my eye is flowing smoothly or naturally through the picture because of the immense visual weight on this side, not to mention the fact that the sky and the colors are stronger on this side. So again, given what I have in this picture, I don't have the ability to walk with you on this beach and perhaps suggest a different composition or you trying something different. But given what I have, this is a much stronger image. Now you can see how our eye is maintained up and down, how we move through the picture this way, okay? And we don't have that distraction of moving off to the left. The visual weight, which is so strong, is now central to the image. It keeps us engaged in the middle of the image. So this is, from a design standpoint, a stronger image. Of course, I might compose this differently where I am in the field. I'm not suggesting that this is a final image or a finished image. I'm, again, showing you how to improve what you've sent me. And the second part of this would be to increase the movement of our eye through this picture. So the way I would do that is by pushing up the whites, a bit more contrast, opens up the sky for us, really gives us a sense of depth now with that beautiful color in the background. Add some clarity, an adjustment brush to increase the feel of the water. By that I mean the movement of the water, because the water is moving and it's flowing in and out with the tide. Maybe not that last one. A new adjustment brush, darken. Maybe darken this area in here. Maybe in there. Maybe a little bit brighter overall in terms of the image. And then I'm going to pull down a graduated filter and make that sky more dramatic, more evocative. I'm going to push up the vibrance on the image overall. And I'll stop there. There's the before and there's the after, okay? The tones, the movement of the eye along these highlights, much stronger here. You really can feel that surf flowing in, and the weight of the image is much more balanced. it's much simpler. It's a simpler statement that I think is the way you have to be thinking about all your images. And so that's how I would suggest improving the design of this image in a way that makes it feel unified, creates a strong center of interest, and leads the viewer through the picture. All right, thank you for sharing. This image is by, don't know, but it's a Maasai woman. What I like about this picture is her expression. It's beautiful. She's looking right at the camera. She seems happy. She seems happy to either be having her picture taken or she's proud of who she is. She's obviously wearing some very cultural and important clothing for her and for her culture. And I really, really like that. I think what can be improved here is perhaps making her gaze a little bit stronger. By that, I'm saying making the composition a bit simpler so that we get a little bit more intimate. There's a little bit more of an intimate feeling to the picture. And the other thing that I would suggest is maybe a little more variation in the color. So we've got this very strong saturated blue and orange, and yet I can't help but have my eye led out of the picture down this way. So how can we improve that? Well, we can add a little bit of a vignette. And we can also take advantage of something like the graduated filter, like so, and just slowly back down or slowly decrease the contrast. I mean, this would be 100%. We don't want that. Sometimes when you make this adjustment, it is useful to go to minus 100 because now you can see the full effect, and then we can bring it back until we feel like we have what we're looking for. Maybe something like that. And I would also perhaps use an adjustment brush here, to darken some areas. So again, we are creating more variation. And I'm going to add a little bit up here. One more brush, lighten, and this is going to be just for her face here to really make that stand out and come forward. And notice that I'm not applying it to the entire face. I'm trying to keep it on one side because, again, that creates more depth, right? We've got shadow and highlights. There's before and there's after. Let me take that brush away. There we go. In fact, I might even add a little bit more of that darken brush, which I think is over here, to this part. In fact, let's create a new one here. There we go. Notice how we've got some variation now. So it looks as though it's changing. It's got depth, a little darker, a little brighter. Again, before and after. Great, thank you for sharing. All right, we've got 5 or 6 more. This image is by Bob Baglini. And I would say that this image, well, what I like about the image is, I like 2 things about the image. I like the landscape in the background, and I like the tree in the foreground. And you can see what I'm getting at now, right? We've got 2 parts of the image that are not necessarily connected in any way. We've got the landscape in the back, which I'm tempted to want to explore and see more of and see what's back there. But then I've got this tree that is front and center, occupying more than half of the image diagonally. And it also wants me to explore and investigate that tree. And I think that one robs attention from the other. I think that they are doing a disservice to each other, so to speak, especially because there isn't a clear way to connect the 2 things. There isn't anything that's connecting them both. if we had some, let's say we had some directional light, some warm light that was striking this tree on the side, and that light was also continuing into the background, that's a way to bridge two parts of an image. We don't have that now. We don't really have something like strong light or strong contrast or drama. So I really think that this picture is about the tree. And in order to make it about the tree, you've got to make it about the tree. And you've got to crop it. You've got to make that clear in the image. And I'm doing that by cropping the image this way. Now, there's no question that it's about this tree. We've got this background, which you can still see, but it's not competing. It's basically a backdrop. And now you can go forward and, you can enhance the image. I would definitely suggest warming up a little bit. I would, let me grab an adjustment brush here. Create more variation. It's a bit too flat now. No, don't want that one, sorry. And I'm going to create a new adjustment brush here. This will be dodge or lighten. Oops, wrong one. What happened there? Wrong preset. There we go. Dodge or lighten. Something like that, and a little more vibrance to give us some interesting color. And I think that's where we're looking at, we're starting to really get a sense for this tree, a feel for the textures and for the beautiful kind of graphic nature of the pattern and the repetition along these branches. And I think you appreciate it more without the distraction, quite frankly, of the background. All right, so I hope that's helpful. Thanks, Bob, for sharing. Again, there's the before and there's the after. This image is by David Kaplan. Thanks, Dave, for sharing. It looks a bit blurry on my screen. It's because it's a very, very small image. So it's 240 by 320. So the pixel resolution is not big enough. So you'll have to deal with that for now. So it's not your monitor. It's just a small image. But generally speaking, I love the way that your eye moves through this picture. It really builds from the bottom left-hand side here along the light and up to the ridge in the back. And so I would say that you could say the focal point of the image is essentially where you wind up at, which is this beautiful mountain in the background. And this is what gets you there. But the center of interest for me is the light. The light is what's creating the movement. It's what's creating the texture, creating the drama in the picture. So a beautiful capture here of light as the subject matter. And I don't know that I would do anything to the picture. Perhaps I would make the bottom a bit less interesting because you've got the strength to push the viewer through the picture. So maybe something like darkening a little bit more here. And make that a bit more suggestive, right? We don't need to see everything that's down here. We just need to know that that's in shadow, that's in darkness. Your eye is not going to linger here. It's not going to linger there because there is beautiful, strong, evocative light next to it. And that's what your eye is going to follow up through the picture. Don't be afraid of shadows that don't have a lot of let's say, detail in them. You only need to worry about that when the shadows are integral to the composition. But here, what makes the composition work is the strong diagonal of light and this movement up from the bottom left to top right. Same thing over here. We can definitely darken down that light there. We don't need that light up there because that's just a distraction for the edge. This is arguably the strongest movement. All right, so thanks for sharing, Dave. Good job. Next image is by Susan Ashley. Thank you, Susan, for sharing. So I love First, the shape of those trees. I think you could say that that's the focal point of the image, or the subject of the image is these trees here creating this beautiful shape. We've got this foreground that looks like a path that's leading you in, and then you've got this looks like it's a night scene, so you've got the lights of the city in the background, and we've got some stars in the sky. I think the main challenge with this picture is maintaining the strength of the interesting shapes. So this is our most interesting shape in the picture because it has lots of different intervals. It's got change, it's got variation, it's got everything that makes a shape interesting, right? Which is that it's not uniform, it's not similar, it's not repetitive. It's repetitive, but in a way that changes, and that's what we love about things that change. You've got this very big shape on top, which is almost the same size in terms of the amount of space that it occupies in the picture, and yet we know that this is more interesting. And even more so, we've got this really big shape down here, which is the least interesting of all the shapes in the picture and occupies almost a third. And again, I think that the most interesting part of this picture is the trees. So, yes, we need to make that obvious. Now, I don't want to take out all the stars. Those stars add context, they add interest. But even that, we still see that it's a night sky with stars in the background. Once you've got 3, 4, 5 stars, your eye, your mind will imagine the rest. Your mind will fill in the rest. We don't need to show more stars to know that there are more stars in the sky, yet the effect is still there. I would even bring in the bottom a bit more. To really anchor this interesting shape in the bottom of the frame. And same thing on this side. Maybe a little bit more. Now we've got a picture where your eye moves left and right across this shape. It sees or finds interesting the stars in the background, but the shape is dominant, and we still haven't lost any of the feel of the mood of the picture. All the extra stuff was just there because we all make these kinds of visual errors where we think that we need to include more in the picture, and yet a lot of times making it simpler is ideal. The other thing I would do here very quickly is I would darken this light here, whatever that is. We could even take that out with a little cloning brush or the spotting tool, something like that. All right, so thanks for sharing, Susan. This image is by Bill Higgins. Thanks for sharing, Bill. Just drinking a bit of tea here. Someone is asking, you have more brushes than I have. Are these add-ons from somewhere? Nope. Everything I'm using are brushes included in Lightroom Classic. And I believe they're also included in Lightroom, the mobile version or the desktop mobile version. So I'm not aware of any additional brushes. These are all brushes that are included in Lightroom. I'll show them when I get into doing any adjustments here, but it could be that you may not be finding them in the interface. I'll show you very quickly. This image here by Bill, I like the colors. I like, again, the soft quality of the light. It's allowing the image to breathe, so to speak. Strong light in a picture like this would probably render a lot of the leaves harsh. It would definitely make the water very harsh because you get specular highlights on the water. And so lots of times strong sunlight is not ideal for scenes like this. Whenever it's raining or foggy or misty, that's when I go out to places like this because the light is softer and you get a much more evocative image. My eye pretty much flows along this area. This is somewhat important. This is not important because it's a distraction. It basically makes me go this way. We don't want the eye, we don't want the eye to go that way. So we need to simplify this picture. Now, I like those rocks there in the bottom, but again, where I'm making this in the field, I might move, obviously, but that's the best we can do. That's the best I can do with this here. But I think something like that is where you want to be. So you've still got elements of the foliage. You still have the context of the image preserved. You know, you're in a beautiful waterfall with color, but the eye is now much more interested in what's happening with the rhythm and the flow of the image, which is this nice diagonal. You don't need so many yellows up here. You've got plenty of yellows through the image. And in fact, these yellows back here, I would say, are more interesting because they are flowing along the front to back nature of the picture. And we always want to try to maintain or to improve a sense of depth in the image. Once you've got the composition where you want it, then you can start to interpret the image to highlight the things that you were attracted to. And again, I'm a big fan of the dodging and burning. So in Lightroom, for the person who asked about the adjustment brushes, they're all found in the develop module here just below the histogram. You've got the adjustment brush here, the radial filter, graduated filter, and the rest of these are red eye reduction and the spotting tool. So I click here on the adjustment brush, or you can press the, I believe is the M key or K, one of those two for the adjustment brush. I forget now, K. And then I can increase or decrease the size of the brush by using the left and right bracket keys. And I'm going to select the preset here, which is to lighten. And we need to make this water a lot more interesting by giving it some highlights. Same thing with this here. I'm going to increase the amount of the exposure setting that I have here for this brush. Okay, something like that. When thinking about where to apply adjustment brushes, where to lighten and darken things, look at the light that's already in the picture. You can easily see how these bushes here have light on one side and shadow on the other. If they didn't, they would look like flat cardboard cutouts. The fact that they have variation in light from one side to the other is what creates the illusion of form and depth in the picture. And that's what I'm using. That's what I'm enhancing in the picture to give us more interest. Okay, so I added that. That's what that looks like. And then I'm going to create a new adjustment brush here. And this will be darken. And I'm just going to darken some areas that improve that sense of depth. Not a whole lot here. And then overall, I would probably just push up the exposure a tiny bit. And a little bit in clarity, a little bit in contrast. There's the before, and there's the after. All right, thanks, Bill, for sharing. This image is by Richard Distelrath. I hope I got that right. Richard, thank you for sharing. Beautiful scene here, beautiful landscape, beautiful colors, beautiful repeating shapes. I love the depth moving from front to back, beautiful layering. There's a nice sense of the foreground, middle ground, and the background. And of course, we have the added bonus of having the beautiful celestial object there, which is the moon. I think that the visual weight of the image is a bit too stretched. And by that I mean that is a lot to ask. I think it's a lot to ask of a viewer to go from here all the way over here. In fact, I would argue that this is a much stronger connection. You've got the moon, which is in the sky. It's the only object in the sky, so that's going to be a strong area of interest. Now, notice I didn't say the center of interest, but an area of interest. And then this area of interest here is also going to dominate everything on the horizon because it's highest, it's brightest, it's most dramatic. Not so much over here. So I would suggest a crop, maybe something like that. And I think that's a much stronger image because now we're not asked, well, the design is not as stretched from left to right. We've got a stronger diagonal. The shapes are somewhat simpler, yet everything about the image is still maintained. That depth, that repetition of the shapes, the beautiful color, the beautiful ambiance, just the mood and feel of the image. This is a case now where you could say the moon is an area of interest, the mountain is an area of interest, but the center of interest is neither of those things. The center of interest for me is the dramatic quality of the light. It's just the dramatic nature of the scene. It's just the awe and wonder that we feel whenever we're presented with a beautiful scene like this. Being able to capture that in an image is about how you design and how you put the different elements together. So I think that little adjustment there, I think, strengthens it and makes it much more apparent. All right, so thank you, Richard, for sharing. One last one. This is by Ron Lacey. Thanks, Ron, for sharing. This is another image, again, that is very simple. I love the simplicity, the way your eye moves through the picture. That's very well done. We've got repeating shapes that help us move through the picture. Nothing that feels out of place. So again, LCU, right? The eye can easily flow through the picture. There's not a specific leading line, but we've got this shape down here, which is closest to us and is made up of a particular texture and a particular color. And then we pick up these bigger shapes. So that leads us front to back because the shapes are overlapping and they get lighter as they go into the back. And those are things that our eye seeks and looks for. We like to see patterns and of repetition in patterns. So that's, you're leading the eye through the image. The center of interest, this is another great example of the center of interest being the light in the scene. The center of interest is the light, and we can see the light because we see how it's being reflected from the sky on the sides of these cliffs here. And the unity in the image is achieved through the fact that everything feels like it belongs. So great composition. Yes, I know there's a waterfall here, but I wouldn't call that the center of interest. That's an area of interest, but it's not the most important thing. In fact, the fact that this is much brighter and more evocative, more dramatic, tells us that this is more important. If we were to go here and make this waterfall very bright and obvious, that would detract from the image. The only thing that I would suggest with this image is a little bit more separation. By that I mean that in terms of the tone, well, not so much tone, in terms of the color in the image, the cast in the image, it's all warm front to back. And I think that if we were to separate the front from the back, so give the warmth here a little more separation from the coolness, I think that would improve the image. I think it can improve the image. So I'm thinking about adding coolness to the shadows and leaving the highlights the way they are. Now, how could we do that? Well, one advanced, or not advanced, but one thing that people may not be aware of is that you can use split toning to achieve this effect. So I'm going to go hit D for develop, go to split toning, and I'm going to adjust the shadows. And I'm going to put the shadows, well, I got to select a hue first. So the way the split toning works is that you can select the hue, that is essentially the color, and then the amount of that color that you want to add to the image. A shortcut for that is for selecting the hue is if you hold down the Option key and then click and drag on the hue slider, it immediately goes to 100% saturation of that hue so that you can find the color a bit easier. So I'm going to say that the blues that I'm looking for are somewhere around there. Then I let go of the Option key. Now we're back at a saturation of 0, and then I can add this saturation slowly to taste. Okay, there's the before. where the entire image has sort of this warm cast to it, which is beautiful. Here's the after, and maybe it's a little bit too much, so I'll back off a little bit. But now we've got a little bit of a cooling into the shadows, which is going to be natural in nature, and it also increases the sense of depth, because we've got this other component now that our eyes can be attracted to, which is the slight variation between warm and cool. So there's the before, and there's the after. It's very subtle, but I think it does make a difference, an important difference, to just create something more for the eye to enjoy looking at, something to create interest. Okay, so I think we've got through all the images. One thing that I forgot to do is to show you a few images that of my own that show you this idea of center of interest versus subject matter. So this will take 2 or 3 minutes at most, but just wanted to show you some more examples of this, because I think this is really important and critical, and something that is worth understanding. So I'm going to go down here. Okay, so take away the panels here. In this image, you really don't know what the center of interest is, or the subject matter, let's say. I mean, yes, you could say the subject matter is trees with light, but there's not one specific focal point. There's not one thing that you are attracted to. Your eye can take in the entire picture. Your eye can move through the picture. Your eye can explore as much as it wants. In fact, I'm not even leading you to a specific place, but the way that I have arranged the shapes, the way I've created the pattern, is what makes the image feel as though you can easily flow through it. So the center of interest for me is the light. The way that the light creates these diagonals from bottom left to top right as it catches the trees, and the trees create shadows in the foreground. And then the trees themselves create this beautiful repetition, but the repetition is very uneven. It's very random. It's very variable, and we love to see things that change and vary like that. All right, so this is again an example where the center of interest is just the light and the repetition, but the focal point is the trees, let's say, and where I focused is probably a third of the way in. So where you focus the camera is different from everything else. That's really a question of maintaining depth of field in your picture, making sure that you're capturing what you want to capture from front to back sharply, and then letting things blur out as well. So I don't need or didn't need to make sure that the background back here was super sharp, because I want that to kind of just recede into the distance. Again, I'm always thinking about creating depth, and one of the ways to create depth is by varying how sharp things are. Okay. Here's another image where I used a very wide angle lens. It's a very wide landscape, very broad, right? So it's not like I'm narrowing the scene down. This is maybe 20 millimeters on a full frame camera. The subject matter is arguable. You could say the subject matter is the yellow flowers in the foreground. That's certainly the main subject in the picture. But the center of interest really is not the flowers. It's the way everything works together. It's the way your eye moves from the front to the back, the light, the mountains in the distance, sort of the whole ambiance of the picture. And the starkness of the desert with those little flowers growing gives you an accent point, a way for your eye to move through the scene. But certainly everything is working in concert. Everything's working together. If I had a flower sticking in on the left-hand side here, or flowers all up on this ridge here, that might be a distraction. It might break that simple continuity. And I had to work pretty hard to find just a simple pattern of flowers, because there were more flowers left and right of me. The point wasn't to add as many flowers. The point was to make the simplest image with the least amount of information possible, yet maintain the integrity of what I was experiencing. Okay. Here's another example of a very wide angle, not too wide. I think this is probably in the mid-20s, but an example where light is probably the main thing that's You can see through the image, it's that soft, sort of overcast, warm light that only lasted a couple of seconds. This is that situation you're all familiar with where the sun pops out and then it goes behind some clouds, and there's a tiny interval between when the sun is completely blocked and when it's not blocked, where the light is strong enough to create shadows, but not so strong that the shadows are strong and harsh, where the light isn't so harsh, and yet it hasn't gone behind the clouds yet, where the light just gets completely diffuse and you get no shadows. I wanted to find that middle point, and I'm anchoring the image with this rock in the foreground. That creates the leading or the anchor into the picture, but the center of interest arguably is the arch in the back here. That's where your eye is going to go. And your eye is going to go here because I'm telling you to go there, because I'm giving you a very clear path with the use of another variable shape, which is these green bushes. Okay? And then eventually you wind up here, and of course there's more to explore, and you're going to want to come back down again. The clouds in the back, being of a much cooler nature, provide a backdrop. They move to the back and they push the landscape and the warmth of the rocks, the warmth of the desert forward. Another image here where light is, again, probably the center of interest, and not just the light, but the feel that it communicates, the mood that it creates in the picture. And I'm making sure that because the light is the most important thing, that there's nothing in the picture itself that is going to distract from the light. And so I'm giving you a very clear way to move through the picture, up through these leaves that are repetitive. And then this tree here is really critical, because without this tree, you basically get lost back here. This tree gives you another way to move up there. And again, look at that S curve, right? Look at the way your eye moves through an S, and these trees bring you back down again. So being aware, being cognizant of the design of the picture and how your eye is going to move through an image is really, really important. And this is what I'm trying to share here. One last picture. This is, again, center of interest is not quite sure what the center of interest is, except for the mood and the feel that I'm trying to convey, right? I'm in the forest, close to home. I find myself in this misty, kind of foggy, dreary weather, and yet light slowly starts to stream in through the sky, and I find these rocks that just have these beautiful shapes. They're cracked, they've got lichen growing on them, they've got irregular shapes, and then I find a way to move from one shape here to another shape here to arguably a third shape here that is subdivided or creating repetition with these trees. And so your eye's moving this way, then here, and then this way. So I'm trying to find many ways for your eye to move and to explore through the picture, but I'm trying to keep it unified. And the way you keep it unified is by making sure that this shape here, for the most part, reads as one general shape. It's just trees with fog. There's not a tree here that has orange leaves on it, because that would be a distraction. That would be something that would break the unity of this shape. This shape here, again, is fairly simple, and this shape here is also fairly simple, but they all kind of work with each other. They work by themselves and together as a whole. And the reason for that is because the light is even and consistent from front to back. That's what connects foreground, middle ground, background. And in fact, that's what I have here: foreground, middle ground, background. So the way to think about these things is to practice. That's the only way I can tell you. It's to practice, to look at lots of different pictures, to look at lots of different artwork, to look at paintings, to look at all kinds of art, to think about relationships, to practice, to not be afraid to fail, to try new things, to look for ways to fail. I mean, you could think of it that way. I will try different compositions, even if I'm not sure they're going to work, but I would push myself to extreme feelings of discomfort. By that I mean like, oh God, there's no way I'm going to make this work. But nonetheless, I find little solutions to problems. And as you get better and better, those little ways of finding solutions build up and add up and contribute to your ability to see. And even if I'm walking around without my camera, or even if you got your iPhone, the iPhone is an amazingly good way to practice composition, because you can just walk around and practice all the time. And in fact, that's what I do. I think it's one of the best tools that you could possibly think of to practice your composition, because you take a picture with your iPhone, you look at it, and you can evaluate whether the composition works or not. You're not going to share. You don't have to share. You don't have to worry about technical perfection. You don't have to worry about sharpness or anything like that. You're just thinking about design, how to combine different elements in a frame so that they work. All right, guys. Hope that was helpful. Thank you very much for joining me again. And look for the replay email tomorrow. And we'll see you here again next week. Thanks very much. Be safe. Take care.